October 14, 1944. Aliceville, Alabama, the freight yard at dawn. The train breathed its last rattling shudder and exhaled a column of steam into the low, humid air. Men pressed to narrow, barred windows, dirt-smudged faces, hollow-eyed and wary, watched pale pines and flat fields glide by like a slow-motion film of a world they scarcely recognized. Inside Car 7, Gefreiter Karlmuller's hand found the splintered wood of the bench until his fingers ached. His uniform still smelled faintly of diesel and the wet earth of France. Beside him, Lieutenant Hans Becker smoothed the crease on his collar, the silver pip of a lieutenant catching the weak sun and throwing a small, hard reflection onto the floor. They had been prisoners for months. The Atlantic crossing had been a blur of gray water, ration tins, and the indifferent churn of the sea. Now the horizon had a different hue, hotter, slower, and somehow less hostile, and their hearts beat with a question they did not yet have words for. At the platform, the American guards moved with a casual efficiency that made the Germans rank and straighten almost out of habit. Captain Robert Hayes of the 106th Military Police stepped forward in his pressed olive drab, a cigarette pinched between two fingers. His face was open, not unkind, but the men understood the distance in his posture, responsibility crossed with battle fatigue. Behind him a jeep idled, a sergeant with an M1 slung across his shoulder barked curt directions, his voice rough with long days on the road. A banner of dust rose as the train doors hissed open and the clang of metal against metal broke the fragile silence. The prisoners were ushered out into the thin sun, blinking as if into another continent. The air smelled of cut hay and spilled motor oil, not gunpowder. For a moment a strange, private thing happened. Karl inhaled as if he were tasting air for the first time. They were marched across a gravel lot toward a cluster of low, wooden barracks ringed by barbed wire and watchtowers. The tower's occupants were visible only as dark silhouettes, rifles poised, binoculars slung like inert necklaces. The wire glinted with dew. Yet the barracks, patched, earnest, lined in neat rows, had window curtains and smoke curling from a mess hall chimney. Dogs barked someplace beyond the perimeter. A woman in a bright dress waved a hand to a soldier on the gate. Even from a distance, her laughter seemed incongruous to the men who had known only blackout curtains and sirens. "You will be processed," an interpreter said in clipped German. The word felt like a promise and a threat at once. Papers were stamped, names recorded. Lieutenant Becker's file was taken with the reverence of someone cataloging a relic. A thin man named Joseph Kruger, a baker from Dortmund before the war, watched as an American clerk slid a photograph into a ledger and then handed him a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, wrapped like a present, lay a bar of chocolate and a small envelope with a single, typed line, "Welcome, U.S. Army." Kruger's hands trembled. He had not expected such triviality. That afternoon the prisoners were given their first walk around the compound under guard. What seized them wasn't merely the absence of trenches or the lack of mud, it was the presence of things they had been taught did not exist: a library with wooden shelves at the end of the row, a bulletin board plastered with baseball scores and a notice for a Saturday movie showing, and a sports field where men tossed a ball in the long, diffused sunlight. A few German soldiers slowed and watched an American corporal roll a baseball across the field, knees low, laugh light as a conversation in a foreign dialect. One of the guards, Private First Class James Morgan, called out a cautious "want to try," and tossed the ball toward a group of prisoners. The ball arced, and for a breathless second, Karl felt the world narrow to the leather in his hands and the weight of the sphere. He had been a schoolboy once, catching stones thrown by friends in a square in Essen. He could not immediately explain the ache that rose in him, bitterness, disbelief, and a sudden, painful nostalgia. Even more bewildering were the uniforms of the men who walked among them without weapons: Red Cross volunteers in plain skirts and shirts, offering cigarettes and cups of coffee, a civilian dentist in a white coat instructing a line of prisoners to sit for checkups, ministers from a small local church distributing blankets marked with stitched crosses. There were work orders posted on wooden boards, options, not demands, for carpentry, farm labor, and mechanics. The idea of work at the camp did not mean forced labor in the underground factories they had heard whispered about. Instead, it meant steady hours, food, and a small wage in scrip that could be exchanged at the canteen. Lieutenant Becker studied the bulletin that listed library hours and vocational classes. He felt something like anger at himself for the quick leap to suspicion, and then a deeper, unnameable disorientation as a new pattern formed in his mind. Perhaps some things in this strange place were real. Night fell with a softness the men had not felt at the front. Lanterns flickered along the barracks. Voices rose in small clusters: German, careful English, and the occasional hesitant attempt at conversation between prisoners and guards. In the mess hall, long tables held portions of stewed beef and mashed potatoes. The portion size and warmth were small revolutions. A young American lieutenant approached Joseph Kruger with a tray and, with a clumsy attempt at German, asked about his hometown. Kruger answered haltingly, then, in a moment of bluntness, asked why they were treated with such civility. The lieutenant shrugged, lips tightening. "Because we are not beasts," he said simply. The sentence was uncomplicated, but its implications were heavy as lead. As the prisoners lay on narrow cots that night, the hum of an electric fan above them, their thoughts turned like pages. For months they had been fed a steady diet of propaganda that painted the Allies as monsters. Now the ordinary kindnesses, a hot meal, a game of baseball, a library card, formed a counter-narrative that seemed almost dangerous to accept. Carl rolled onto his back and looked up at the wooden rafters as if expecting to see the world tilt and reveal some hidden trap. The rafters held only the dim glow of the lantern and a ceiling fan slowly slicing the air. Somewhere beyond the wire, a radio played a Tin Pan Alley tune that sounded oddly sentimental and, to Carl's startled mind, suspiciously free. October 16, 1944, 2 days later, Aliceville POW camp. Morning mist hung over the Alabama pines, soft as gauze. Bugles sounded across the camp, but there was no barked anger in the rhythm, just the ordered hum of a place that functioned without hatred. Carl Muller rose at the call, the scent of coffee drifting faintly through the slatted barracks. For a moment he simply sat, staring at his hands, remembering the sound of artillery that used to drag him from sleep. Here, the only thunder came from trains passing somewhere beyond the horizon, carrying lumber and cotton instead of soldiers. Outside, the sun began to melt the fog from the fences. Prisoners lined up for roll call, some joked in low voices, others still scanned the towers as if expecting a change in mood. The guards watched but did not shout. Private Morgan walked by with his usual crooked grin, handing out the morning newspaper to one of the interpreters. It was an English-language edition of the Birmingham News, headlines about baseball scores, not the front line. Carl caught a glimpse of the Words World Series and tried to remember when he last saw news that wasn't about war or death. At breakfast, the men ate oatmeal and buttered toast. Becker, ever precise, noted the texture: warm, soft, absurdly domestic. "They feed us like guests," he muttered, shaking his head. Across from him, Kruger replied softly, "Maybe they just want to prove something." His words hung there, not cynicism, not gratitude, just confusion that this could exist in a world that had burned for 5 years. After the meal, work assignments were announced. Some men volunteered for farm labor outside the camp fences, under guard, but still beyond the wire. Carl raised his hand. He needed to see what lay past the boundary, to know if this strange world of civility extended beyond the barracks. A truck rumbled out of the gate with 20 prisoners in the back, passing a sign that read Aliceville Army Service Unit No. 1 Agricultural Detail. The countryside rolled past red earth, cotton fields, small houses with porches shaded by magnolia trees. Children on bicycles paused and waved. A few women carrying baskets stopped to stare but did not jeer. Carl couldn't decide if he was part of a dream or some careful performance meant to confuse him. At the farm, the prisoners helped harvest peanuts under the supervision of Sergeant Miller, a middle-aged man with a thick southern drawl and a sunburn that made him look perpetually angry, though his eyes weren't unkind. "You do your work right," he said, "and nobody's gonna bother you." He handed Carl a shovel, then lit a cigarette. "You boys ever farmed before?" Carl nodded. His father had grown potatoes outside Essen. Miller raised an eyebrow. "Then you'll manage. Ground don't care what language you speak." By midday the heat was punishing, but the labor had a rhythm: bend, dig, toss, that calmed the mind. When the break whistle blew, Miller brought out a cooler of water bottles and sandwiches. The men hesitated, expecting some trick, but he simply waved. "Go on, eat. Ain't poison." Laughter rippled uncertainly through the group. Carl bit into his first peanut butter sandwich, sweet, heavy, clinging to the roof of his mouth. It was alien, yet oddly comforting. Becker watched him and smiled faintly. "If this is captivity," he murmured, "perhaps the world has gone mad in a good way." That afternoon, a Red Cross jeep arrived to inspect the work detail. The driver, a young woman named Eleanor Briggs, stepped down in a pressed khaki skirt and took notes with brisk professionalism. When she saw Carl struggling with the English on a safety sign, she offered a translation in hesitant German. He blinked, surprised. "You speak our language?" he asked. "A little," she said, smiling. "Enough to keep you from breaking your neck." He laughed, an involuntary, startled sound, and for a fleeting second the air between them carried something almost normal, almost human. Back at camp, evening brought recreation hour. The Americans encouraged music and art, perhaps believing creativity dulled resentment. A small orchestra had formed, prisoners with salvaged instruments and astonishing talent. That night they played Schubert's Serenade under lantern light, the notes curling like smoke toward the guards' towers. For a long time, no one spoke. Then one guard, leaning on his rifle, whispered, "They play like they ain't prisoners." In the days that followed, the POWs settled into a rhythm of improbable comfort, classes in English and mathematics, letters home through Red Cross channels, Sunday sermons for those who wanted them. Yet each kindness came wrapped in disbelief. Becker found himself writing in his journal late one night, "I do not know if this is victory or defeat. Perhaps both." As winter crept toward Alabama, rumors spread that the war in Europe might soon end. The men whispered about repatriation, about seeing their families again. But beneath the surface, another kind of reflection took hold, quiet, unsettling, and moral. What did it mean, Carl wondered, that the enemy treated them better than their own army had treated conquered civilians? Could mercy also be a weapon, or was it, perhaps, something nobler? One cold December night, as frost silvered the wire, a radio in the mess hall broadcast Bing Crosby's "I'll Be Home for Christmas." The song's gentle melancholy filled the room. Some prisoners closed their eyes. Becker whispered, "If I live to return home, I will never forget this song." Outside, the guards leaned against the fence, listening in silence, two worlds separated by wire but united, for a moment, by melody. Life inside the camp was, to many German prisoners, almost incomprehensibly different from the rigid, harsh environment they had left behind. At first, they approached the rules and routines with skepticism. Guards were friendly rather than intimidating, and there was no expectation of blind obedience to authority. Many POWs had grown accustomed to the harsh militaristic discipline of the Wehrmacht, where deviation from orders could mean punishment or death. Now, here in the American camp, such strictness was replaced by structure, but with a humanity that many found almost disarming. The prisoners were free to walk around the compounds, engage in leisure activities, and even converse openly with the guards without fear of reprimand. For men who had been trained for total loyalty to a system that valued obedience above all else, this was a revelation. Some POWs admitted they initially believed it was a trap, that some hidden danger lurked behind the smiles and casual greetings. Yet, as days turned into weeks, the consistency of humane treatment began to erode their suspicion. One of the most striking aspects of camp life was the access to education and recreation. The Americans encouraged prisoners to take up hobbies, read books, or participate in organized classes. Art and music were particularly popular. Some POWs had been professional musicians or artists before the war, and now they had the opportunity to practice their craft. Camp newspapers, printed by the prisoners themselves under American supervision, offered a sense of normalcy and even humor. They wrote about camp events, personal reflections, and sometimes subtle critiques of their own military experiences. Work assignments, too, were handled with care. Rather than harsh forced labor, the tasks assigned were often designed to keep the prisoners active and engaged. Farming, maintenance, and other essential work not only provided physical activity but also gave them a sense of purpose. Prisoners who had never considered themselves capable of manual labor discovered skills they had never tapped before. And though they were working, it was done in a spirit of cooperation, not oppression. Meals were another source of astonishment. The German soldiers had expected the meager rations typical of wartime captivity, but the American camps offered ample, nutritious food. While not luxurious, the regularity and quality of the meals created a sense of stability and security that contrasted sharply with the hunger and deprivation they had witnessed in European theaters of war. For some, the simple act of sitting down to eat without fear or scarcity felt revolutionary. Religious freedom was also respected. Chaplains and spiritual leaders were allowed to conduct services, and prisoners could practice their faith openly. This was particularly meaningful for those who had suffered spiritually as well as physically during the war. Many prisoners attended services not just out of devotion but as a social gathering, connecting with others in a peaceful and reflective environment. Perhaps most importantly, the Americans treated the prisoners as human beings with dignity, rather than as symbols of an enemy. Letters home were encouraged, and the mail system was surprisingly efficient. Many POWs wrote candidly to their families, describing the stark contrast between life in American camps and their expectations. Parents and spouses were often incredulous, unable to believe that their sons and husbands were being treated with such fairness. These letters became lifelines, not just for the prisoners but for their families, providing reassurance that, despite being at war, their loved ones were alive and reasonably comfortable. The social hierarchy among the prisoners also shifted. In Germany, rank dictated respect and authority, but in the camp, those distinctions were less rigid. Ordinary soldiers often took on leadership roles within committees or activity groups, while officers sometimes struggled to adapt to a system where authority was no longer absolute. In this environment, cooperation and negotiation replaced fear and coercion. Disputes were often resolved through discussion rather than intimidation, a foreign concept to men trained in the ruthless chain of command of the German military. Daily routines included physical exercise, educational classes, and social interactions. Sports became a key outlet. Soccer matches, volleyball games, and improvised athletic competitions brought prisoners together, forging friendships that transcended rank and previous loyalties. These activities not only improved morale but also demonstrated the Americans' commitment to the prisoners' overall well-being. Some prisoners even began to reflect on their actions during the war. Exposure to humane treatment and freedom prompted moral introspection. While not all embraced these thoughts, for many it planted seeds of change. They began to question the ideology they had followed unquestioningly. For a group of men who had been trained to accept cruelty as normal, the American approach was both bewildering and enlightening. Despite the freedom and comfort, life in the camp was still constrained. Prisoners could not leave, and the looming uncertainty about their future hung over every interaction. Repatriation could take months, and rumors of lingering conflict in Europe created anxiety. Yet, within these walls, they experienced a taste of liberty that most had never imagined possible. This experience would linger long after the war ended, shaping perceptions of humanity, authority, and compassion in ways that would resonate for decades. In essence, the American POW camps demonstrated a radical experiment in humane treatment of enemy soldiers. By fostering dignity, freedom, and education, the camps challenged deeply ingrained notions of control and punishment. The prisoners, initially skeptical and wary, gradually began to see the value of respect, cooperation, and personal responsibility. For many, this period of captivity became a turning point, a moment where the harsh realities of war collided with the possibility of kindness and freedom. As months passed, the American POW camps became more than just a holding place, they became a microcosm of a different world. The prisoners began to internalize aspects of life they had never encountered: fairness, respect, and personal choice. The initial skepticism faded, replaced by cautious curiosity, and eventually, a grudging appreciation. Some POWs even described a strange sense of community that developed among them, built not on fear or coercion, but on mutual respect and shared experience. Letters from home continued to arrive, bringing news of families, towns, and lives that seemed almost suspended in time. Many prisoners wrote in detail about the treatment they received in the camps, trying to assure their loved ones that, despite being at war, they were living under conditions far better than expected. Parents and wives who read these letters were often astonished, struggling to reconcile the grim reports from the front with the almost domestic reality described in the camp correspondence. Education programs flourished. The Americans offered lessons in English, mathematics, geography, and even vocational skills. For some prisoners, this was an unprecedented opportunity to learn and prepare for a life beyond the military. The literacy rate and educational levels among POWs improved markedly, and a few even took up creative writing, recording their experiences and reflections. These activities were not just a way to pass time, they were a path toward intellectual and emotional growth. Cultural and artistic exchanges also emerged. Prisoners staged theatrical performances, musical concerts, and art exhibitions. Plays were written, rehearsed, and performed entirely by the prisoners, often drawing on German folklore or their own wartime experiences. Art competitions encouraged prisoners to paint or sketch, and music recitals became social highlights. Guards attended some performances, cheering and applauding, which further blurred the lines between captor and captive. For many, these moments provided a glimpse of normal life, a life defined not by obedience to war, but by creativity, expression, and shared enjoyment. Sports remained a central feature of camp life. Soccer tournaments, volleyball matches, and relay races were organized regularly. Teams were formed, competitions were held, and spectators cheered. These games were more than recreation, they were exercises in discipline, teamwork, and camaraderie. Many prisoners recalled that participating in sports not only strengthened their bodies but also fostered trust and friendship across ranks that had previously been rigidly separated in the German military hierarchy. Prisoners were encouraged to take responsibility for aspects of their daily lives. Committee systems allowed POWs to manage canteen operations, organize educational classes, and plan recreational activities. These responsibilities created a sense of agency and self-determination that was entirely foreign to men accustomed to strict military command structures. By having a say in their own lives, prisoners began to see themselves as individuals with choices, rather than mere instruments of war. Occasionally, conflicts arose. Disputes over resources, assignments, or personal disagreements occurred, just as they would in any community. However, the methods of resolution were markedly different from the harsh disciplinary measures they had known. Prisoners were encouraged to settle disagreements through discussion, compromise, and negotiation. Many admitted that these experiences taught them lessons in diplomacy and conflict resolution they had never learned before. The American approach to leadership within the camp had a profound impact. Officers who had once wielded authority with unquestioned power now had to operate in a system where influence came from persuasion and respect rather than rank. Ordinary soldiers discovered they could lead by example, and the rigid hierarchy of military life gave way to a more fluid social order. POWs described this as both liberating and bewildering, challenging assumptions about authority, obedience, and fairness. As the war in Europe drew to a close, thoughts of repatriation became increasingly pressing. Prisoners knew that leaving the camp would mean returning to a homeland ravaged by conflict and scarcity. Yet many carried with them lessons learned in captivity and understanding of humanity, dignity, and freedom that had been almost unimaginable in the context of war. Letters written to family members during this time often reflected a mixture of relief, hope, and newfound perspective. For some, the experience would leave a lasting mark. Former POWs spoke of a transformation in outlook, a realization that human beings could treat even their enemies with respect. This exposure to compassion challenged the ideologies they had been trained to uphold and, for a number of men, planted the seeds of reflection and personal change. The American camps had become classrooms of morality, empathy, and civility, places where the values of freedom and decency were not abstract concepts, but lived realities. The departure of the prisoners was bittersweet. While the gates opened and freedom beckoned, leaving the camp meant leaving behind a world where men had learned to coexist peacefully despite their differences. Memories of fair treatment, educational opportunities, sports, and camaraderie remained etched in their minds. Many POWs returned to Germany profoundly affected, carrying stories that challenged the traditional narrative of war, cruelty, and enmity. Ultimately, the American POW camps demonstrated that even in the midst of war, human decency could prevail. By providing freedom, education, and dignity to prisoners, the Americans offered an alternative vision, one in which respect and kindness could coexist with military necessity. For the German soldiers who experienced it firsthand, this was nothing short of revolutionary. The lessons learned within those fences would resonate far beyond the end of the war, shaping lives, perspectives, and even post-war reconciliation in ways that few could have predicted. The day of repatriation arrived with a mixture of relief, anticipation, and apprehension. For many prisoners, returning to Germany meant stepping into a world that was unrecognizable after years of war and destruction. Cities lay in ruins, families were displaced, and familiar landscapes had changed forever. Yet, despite the uncertainty awaiting them at home, the experiences within the American camps had left an indelible mark on the men who had once feared captivity. As they boarded transport back to their homeland, conversations among prisoners often revolved around the lessons they had learned. Many spoke of freedom in ways they had never considered possible, recounting simple acts of kindness by guards or the chance to make choices about their daily lives. These moments, they realized, were more than temporary relief from the hardships of war. They were glimpses of a different way of living, one built on respect, responsibility, and trust. Some former POWs returned with skills and knowledge gained during their time in the camps. Education classes, vocational training, and creative pursuits had equipped them with tools they could use to rebuild their lives. The practical lessons in agriculture, trade, and industry proved invaluable in a country struggling to recover from devastation. More importantly, the exposure to new ideas about leadership, cooperation, and empathy left a lasting imprint on their personal and professional lives. Letters written to family members during the journey home often conveyed a sense of wonder and disbelief. Parents, siblings, and spouses who had feared for their loved one's survival were astonished to hear that their sons, brothers, and husbands had been treated with dignity and care. These letters also served as a bridge between the traumatic memories of war and the hope of reconstruction. They told of human decency triumphing over hostility, and in doing so, reshaped the narrative of what captivity could mean. Many POWs found it difficult to reconcile their camp experiences with the harsh realities awaiting them in post-war Germany. The war had left deep scars, physically, emotionally, and socially. Yet, the memories of fair treatment, freedom of movement, access to education, and the ability to make choices served as a moral compass in a time of chaos. These experiences often inspired former prisoners to promote fairness, understanding, and compassion in their communities, carrying forward lessons learned behind barbed wire. Some returned with a renewed sense of reflection and personal growth. Exposure to humane treatment and self-directed activity challenged previously held beliefs about authority, obedience, and morality. Men who had once unquestioningly followed orders found themselves contemplating the value of human life, the meaning of leadership, and the importance of empathy. This introspection did not erase the horrors of war, but it offered a framework for personal transformation and reconciliation. Communities sometimes received these returning soldiers with a mix of curiosity, suspicion, and admiration. Those who shared their camp experiences helped others understand that captivity need not equate to cruelty, and that even in the midst of conflict, human dignity could be preserved. The POWs stories became living testimonies of the potential for compassion, shaping post-war perceptions and fostering bridges between former enemies. For historians and observers, the American POW camps represented a remarkable experiment in humane treatment. By balancing discipline with freedom, providing education and recreation, and encouraging self-governance, the camps challenged traditional notions of imprisonment. They demonstrated that even in wartime, respect for humanity could coexist with military necessity, and that such treatment could have profound effects on the mindset and behavior of those held captive. Ultimately, the experience of German prisoners in American camps stands as a testament to the enduring power of human decency. These men, once trained for war and obedience, left captivity not just as survivors, but as witnesses to the possibilities of compassion, freedom, and dignity. Their stories remind us that even amidst the devastation of global conflict, the simple acts of fairness and respect can leave a legacy that outlives the war itself. And so, when the gates of the camps closed behind them for the last time, the prisoners carried home more than memories of confinement. They carried the lessons of freedom, the proof of humanity's potential, and a glimpse of a world where mercy could triumph over enmity. These were the experiences that would shape their lives, long after the war had ended.